Yo, 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 coming at y'all live. I'm gonna touch something up on my slide just to give myself a reminder. And I'm gonna give it about 5 minutes, maybe even less than that to get started. Who that in the chat? Let's see. I'll shut this little light off. Is that right? Is that right? That's doing that. I think that's good enough. Yeah, I want it right there. I think that's good enough. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So whoever that is in the chat, I'm gonna give it about 2 minutes, about a good 2 solid minutes, and I'm gonna get into it. Let me see here. I'm gonna share this right now though. I'm gonna share what we're gonna be talking about. Pull it up there. Let's see. There it is. See how that look on the screen. That might be how I have to do it, because I don't think it's gonna show the slideshow. So I might have to do it like that. Yep, might have to do it like that. Man, Dallas, appreciate it, man. See you subscribe. Shout out to you, man. That's a good brother right there with a lot of information that the indigenous adversaries probably don't like, but we don't care. We're gonna keep putting out this information, and we're gonna keep doing it thoroughly. And I think this is gonna be a good head busting session, man. I think it is, man. I think it is. Yeah, so that PowerPoint is really just to go by. I could have probably tried to, pull this off the top of my head, but I want to make sure I don't veer off from all of the different points that I want to get at. Generally speaking, well, yeah, let me put up the next slide. You're probably looking at it now. I'm gonna make sure. Yep, as previously discussed. Let me get started in 1 minute, man. I ain't gonna delay this too much longer, cause last time we ran into 4 hours, man. That was a marathon. Try to keep it 2 or below this time. I don't think I'll be getting the 2 any. I don't think I'll be getting the 2 either, but do got some pretty extensive reading to do because I've seen a lot of challenges leading up to today, challenging me to show the actual articles, this, that, and the other. So what I'm gonna do is anybody who's seen the first presentation that I did, I presented the 2009 study on West African admixture pertaining to African Americans. That's what kicked it off. A lot of people had a problem with it. You know what I'm saying? It received a lot of backlash, I guess you can say. I'm gonna read that entire article because people have been saying, you nitpicked. That's not really what the article says. So I'm gonna put that out into the atmosphere in its entirety to allow individuals to make their own determination. And the other reason why I'm doing it as well is because I want to reset the backdrop of how we are leading up to the second article, which really elaborates on the 2009 study. I think that second one is 2014, and it pretty much says what I predicted. Because when I saw that 2009 article, I had not even gotten my hands on that 2014 yet. But in reading the 2009, with what it concluded, I'm like, the only conclusion that you can make is that so-called African Americans share a different ancestry, and so that second article doesn't state that in its entirety, but it states subtleties pertaining to that. And I'm gonna make it clear when I read it. You know what I mean? People probably still be talking. That's okay. You know what I mean? I'm gonna present the evidence, and I'm gonna let it flow. And so I think we about ready to get started, man. I'm gonna kick this off. Don't need any further delays. I might take a pause and get on not chat GPT, but Facebook, talk some trash, to get people to come in here. Those who were saying it, it ain't this, it ain't that, we're going to have to go on there and put the invitation out there even more. But I'm gonna go ahead and get started right now. I might take a break a little bit later to do that, but all right. Previously discussed, 2009 study of admixture in African Americans concluded that the African Americans lacked African structure because of diaspora admixing. That was their conclusion in that 2009 study. So I'm gonna show you where it specifically says that at. I'm going to show you how they explain this anomaly, in African Americans or so-called African Americans pertaining to West Africans. We talked about modern West Africans being a product of recent expansion, Bantu expansion of the oceanic populations not being Negroes because of Neanderthal and Denisovan integration, and the DE origin. So what we're going to discuss today is this stuff. In this discussion, a subsequent study demonstrates that genetic differences are present in the ancestral layers of the African components between African Americans and West Africans, not in the African American Diaspora. Rare Neanderthal and Denisovan variants present in West African populations introduced by Pre-Tarafolt populations. And I guess that's not even pre-Tarafolt is probably wrong. That would have been the Tarafolt population, and I'll explain that. We went over that before in terms of the Tarafolt population, but I'm gonna read that article as well, and what this indicates in terms of deep back migrational patterns of within Africa. CF splitting origin and how this supports origins of DE outside of Africa and migrated to Africa. Albert Perry's wide DNA breakthrough in ancient population structure. Ghost DNA and the possibility of it being foreign into Africa. That was a huge statement in that article, and that's coming directly from the article. That's not something that I'm inferring. That was specifically, said as a possibility in that article. Difference between Sub Saharan signals and West African signals, and how both are defined. I might have to get into that one on another one, because I don't think I pulled those articles. I might be able to pull it off my phone and get it on here. We'll see how much time I got. Signs of ancient population structure in the Americas pre-Siberian migration. All right, on to the next slide. Previously discussed. In this discussion, 2014 study of African American genome indicated that differences in alleles were not due to diaspora and mixing as previously thought. Concluded that differences were present in Africa before slave extraction and later diaspora admixing, which would implicate differences are present in ancestry not later derived due to factors of transatlantic slave trade. Okay. So I'm gonna stop right here and I'm gonna get that article up. I'll stop sharing this, and I'm gonna get back to my share screen, and I'm gonna get that 2009 article up on the screen, and I'm gonna go through the whole thing. Okay, that should be up now. Yep, here it is. All right, so should be able to see that title. I'm gonna make sure it's on the screen. Yes, sir. All right, so this is the very first study I did in the first presentation. The title is Characterizing the Admixed African Ancestry of African Americans. I'm gonna zoom it in, and I'm gonna get straight to it, because this will set the foundation for the second article, which I will read right after this. Abstract. Because people were saying, you didn't read the abstract. You didn't. Like, the conclusion is like the abstract is going to, cancel out the conclusion or something. Come on, y'all. Let's use some logic here. Anyway, background. Accurate, high throughput genotyping allows the fine characterization of genetic ancestry. Here we applied recently developed statistical and computational techniques to the question of African ancestry in African Americans by using data on more than 450,000 single nucleotide polymorphins. genotyped in 94 Africans of diverse geographic origins included in the HGDP, as well as 136 African Americans and 38 European Americans participating in the atherosclerotic disease vascular function and genetic epidemiology study. To focus on African ancestry, we reduced the data to include only those genotypes in each African American determined statistically to be African in origin. I'm gonna blow that up even more. So I wanted to point out something here. So I noticed something before I started this, right? I read this right before I started this background. And you can see here that they have European Americans included in this study. So what I wanted to point out is that this European admixture inference is just that. It's an inference. And the way that we know it's an inference is because they are including Europeans into the study. When I first read this, I'm like, why would they put Europeans in here? The reason why they're putting Europeans in there is because they can use them as a control group for European admixture. But here's the thing. We know that this is inferred because it's based off of basically genotype frequency. So I have a hunch that some of that European admixture is overblown, because I have a hunch that African American ancestry alleles have very much in common with Europeans already, because some of the layers of African Americans are ancestral to Europeans. So it may be, and actually I ran this by, through AI, and I asked AI, was there any studies that stated that or, hinted at that possibility? And it said, yeah. I didn't have time to really incorporate that into this, but maybe that would be another segue off of this in terms of, people automatically assuming, quote unquote, white European when they're seeing these European, percentages being presented for, Black Americans, because a lot of the times there's no way to really determine or separate, white European alleles from, Black Europeans, there are, indigenous Black Europeans, that wouldn't separate statistically from white Europeans. And there are parts of African American ancestry that overlap. The West Eurasian aspect of African Americans does overlap with white Europeans or just Europeans in general. So I just wanted to point that out. These are statistics, and I think these statistics in terms of this European admixture are being way overblown. But that, like I said, that's another topic for another day. All right, so results. Again, I've read this part several times. I don't know what that is. Put my phone on silent. They can text, man. I got some head busting business to get to, man. And, we don't want to get too late into the evening before I get through this. But the results from cluster analysis, we found that all the African Americans are admixed in their African components of ancestry, with the majority contributions being from West and West Central Africa, and only modest variation in these African ancestry proportions among individuals. Furthermore, by principal component analysis, we found little evidence of genetic structure within the African component of ancestry in African Americans. So I think that's pretty clear. You know what I'm saying? The rest of the study is going to reinforce how they came to this conclusion. And like I said, I ain't gonna try to put no thoughts in anybody's mind. I guess a little bit, because I am presenting information. I do have a standpoint on this, but I think everybody's going to see that the rest of the study definitely enforces these results. Now, in the conclusion, these results are consistent with historic mating patterns among African Americans that are largely uncorrelated to African ancestral origin. So here it is implicating that upon these results, they are concluding that these results are due to diaspora admixing. I'll read that sentence again. These results are consistent with historic mating patterns among African Americans that are largely uncorrelated to African ancestral origins, and they cast doubt on the general utility of mtDNA or Y chromosome markers alone to delineate the full African ancestry of African Americans. Our results also indicate that the genetic architecture of African Americans is distinct from that of Africans, and that the greatest source of potential genetic stratification bias is case control studies of African Americans derives from the proportion of European ancestry. So basically what they're saying is that the level of, well, they use the word stratification, basically the level of separation, um, the, the differences are within the European ancestry. And don't get that confused in thinking that these results came from European admixture, because obviously in the results in the previous section here, it indicated that this is focused on the African, components of African Americans in comparison to Africans. So they isolated that in this study. And we're going to read it, I'm going to read the study. All right, so background. Numerous studies have estimated the rate of European admixture in African Americans. These studies have documented average admixture rates in the range of 10 to 20% with some regional variation, but also within substantial variation among individuals. For example, the largest study of African Americans to date based on autosomal short tandem repeat markers found on average of 14% European ancestry with a standard deviation of approximately 10% and a range of near to 0 to 65%, whereas another study based on ancestry informative markers found an average of 17.7 European ancestry with a standard deviation of 15%. By using the 9 AIMs, Parr and colleagues found substantial variation of European ancestry proportions in African American populations across the United States, ranging from just over 10% in the Philadelphia group to more than 20% in New Orleans population. Similar levels of European ancestry also were reported by Tishkoff and co-workers based on more than 1,000 nuclear, microsatellite, and insertion deletion markers. Although much attention has been paid in the genetics literature to the continental admixture underlying the genetic makeup of African Americans, less attention has been paid to the within continental contribution to African Americans, in particular from the continent of Africa. Studies have focused primarily on the maternally inherited mitochondrial DNA and paternally inherited Y chromosome. These two DNA sources have gained wide prominence owing in part to their use by ancestry testing companies to identify the regional and ethnic origins of their subscribers. Yet these two sources provide a very narrow perspective, delineating only two of possibly thousands of ancestral lineages in an individual. So there it is again. Now, I think in part 2 or 3 of this series I've been doing, I had a whole article focused on, the over what's the basically consumer DNAs overstating what they can actually prove. And here it is already. We haven't even really, I don't think we've gotten to the second paragraph in the whole study, and it's reinforced it twice already. But anyway, the majority of African Americans derive their African ancestry from the approximately 500,000 to 650,000 Africans that were forcibly brought to British North America as slaves during the Middle Passage. These individuals were deported primarily from various geographic regions of Western Africa, ranging from Senegal to Nigeria to Angola. Thus, it has been estimated that the majority of African Americans derive ancestry from these geographic regions, although more central and eastern locations also contributed. Recent studies of African American mtDNA haplotypes and autosomal Microsatellite markers also confirm the broad range of Western Africa as the likely roots of most African Americans. The recent development of high density single nucleotide polymorphins genotyping assays used primarily in genome-wide association studies has also provided an unprecedented opportunities to address questions related to the evolution of migration patterns in humans. Most of the GWA studies to date have focused on European or European-derived populations of U.S. Caucasians, but a few few have included minorities. That the latter studies provide unique opportunities to address questions of origins and admixed populations such as African Americans and Latinos. Although the application of high-density genotyping to a broad range of worldwide indigenous populations has not yet been accomplished, and an important first step has been achieved through the recent genotyping of human genome diversity panel. This effort resulted in nearly 1,000 subjects from 51 populations being genotyped at more than 500,000 polymorphic sites. These data now provide a basis for finer scale analysis of the ancestral origins of admixed groups such as African Americans and Latinos, in addition to the enabling the accurate characterization of genetic and evolutionary relationships among these populations. In this study, we characterize the African origins of African Americans by use of the high density genotype data generated for 94 HGDP indigenous Africans from differing geographic and linguistic groups, including 21 Mandinka from West Africa, 21 Yoruba from West Central Africa, 15 Bantu speaking speakers from Southwestern and Eastern Africa, 20 Biaka Pygmy, and 12 Mabutu Pygmy from Central Africa, and 5 San from Southern Africa. These subjects are used to represent the potential African ancestors of 136 African Americans recently genotyped in the GWA study of early onset coronary artery disease. In addition, we include 38 U.S. Caucasian subjects from advanced to represent the European ancestors of African Americans. The density SMP data for ancestral reconstruction represents some statistical and computational challenges. And by the way, part of this presentation is going to cover the the Eurasian portion of ancestry of West Africans. And when I get to that point, I'm a hunker down on that fact, and the fact that African Americans carry themselves a Eurasian component. And I'm gonna put it all together. It's gonna make sense when I get to that part. I think this is a lesser known fact about West Africans, how Africa was shaped, and African American genomes. So, but I'm gonna keep going. To this end, we develop analytic techniques for estimating individual ancestry from multiple populations, as well as for the reconstruction of ancestry blocks in admixed individuals by using data from more than 450,000 SMP genotypes. Here, we provide a unique application of SABRE to identify the ancestral origins of each of the more than 450,000 genotypes in African American individuals to reduce the analysis to those genotypes that are exclusively of African origin. We note that 58 of the advanced African Americans were also participants of the Cardia study and had previously been analyzed with 42 ancestry informative markers. We also use principal component analysis to define the genetic structure, and in particular, the African genetic structure underlying African Americans. Another recent study used principal component analysis for the African populations of HDDP, but did not relate those results to African Americans. To our knowledge, the analysis reported here represent the first effort to characterize the African origin of African Americans by isolating the African-derived genome in each African American individual. All right, so results: African and European ancestry in African Americans. Principal component analysis of more than 450,000 SNPs, including all populations, Africans, African Americans and U.S. Caucasians revealed, as expected, a major separation between African and U.S. Caucasian populations along the first principal component, PC1, whereas the second principal component, PC2, led to the separation of the various African groups. The two pygmy populations, that would be the Biaka and the Mabutu, I think I'm pronouncing that right, and the San of South Africa, are well separated from the other African groups, whereas a greater genetic affinity appears to exist between Mandinka and West Africa, the Yoruba of Central West Africa, and the Bantu speakers who derived from Kenya and Western Africa. It is also clear in Figure 1 that the African Americans lie on a direct line between the European Americans and the West Africans, reflecting their varying levels of admixture between these two ancestral groups. These results were confirmed in the estimation of IA by using the program FRAP. The amount of European ancestry shows considerable variation, with the average of 21.9, 12.2, and a range of 0 to 72%. The largest African ancestral contribution comes from the Yoruba, with the average of 47.1%. I guess the low is 8.7, a range between 18 to 64, followed by the Bantu at 14.8, a low of 5, range between 3 to 28, and Mandinka at 13.8, low of 4.5, and a range between 3 to 29%. Contributions from the other three African groups were quite modest, with the average of 1.7% from the Biaka and 0.5% from the Mabutu and 0.3% from the San. In the bar plot, excuse me. In the bar plot of FRAP estimates, individuals corresponding to their value on the first PC coordinate, clearly this order correlates nearly perfectly with the decrease in proportion of European ancestry. Thus, the most important source of genetic structure in African Americans is based on the degree of European admixture. African components of ancestry in African Americans, we estimate that on average, nearly 80% of the ancestry in our samples of African Americans is of African origin. A careful examination of the African component ancestry so let me take a pause and let me show this. So this would be the first PCA plot. We can clearly see the line that they're talking about. Europeans are separated on the opposite end of the PCA, which is expected, of course. And African Americans sit between Europeans and the West African population. Now, that's the first plot. That's the first plot. Now, a lot of people are, probably trying to make, conclusions, or they might be thinking that, something I've said is already contradictory, but just hold that thought, because it's about to tell you very clearly how it came to the results and conclusions that it did. African Americans and let me make sure this is still on that screen too. Yeah, perfect. So let me go back to it. African Americans is facilitated by restricted analysis to those portions of their genomes that are exclusively of African origin. To do so, we use the program SABRE to infer European versus African-derived alleles for each individual and retain for analysis only those loci that had a high probability of harboring two African-derived alleles, while denoting the other genotypes as missing. For these and all subsequent analyses, we included the 128 African Americans whose estimated African ancestry exceeded 55% based on initial FRAP analysis. So even here, this is just a side note, even here they're telling you that these are estimated. These are estimates, and they're also telling you that those that don't map clearly with the African genome, they're constitute knows as what was the word here? These are the program for each individual return analysis and local African derived what the other they're labeled them as missing. So all throughout this report, we're seeing, kind of like segues from prior topics of, consumer DNA. And this is not even a consumer DNA report. This is it's supposed to be a thorough genetic deep dive into, African American genome. And they're telling you even still amongst these geneticists that this is, statistical. It's highly statistical, may I add. It's not based off of, something they made up. But what I'm saying is it's still statistical. As a validation of the accuracy of this partitioning procedure, we performed PCA on a combined set of U.S. Caucasians, Africans, and African Americans with putative non-African derived genotypes removed. For comparison, we also examined the results of the same analyses, but including all of the genotype data of the African Americans. For these analyses, we included only the 3 African population groups that, based on the first analysis, contributed significantly to the African Americans: the Mandinka, Yoruba, and Bantu. As shown previously, when all genotypes are included, the African Americans lie intermediate between the Africans and European Americans at varying distances based on their degree of admixture. By contrast, when only the putative African-derived genotypes in the African Americans are included, the African Americans now cluster tightly with the Africans. This result provides confidence that the application of SABRE has enabled us to partition accurately the genomes of the African Americans with regard to European versus African ancestry. When then characterized the African ancestry in African Americans by performing PCA and estimating IA with FRAP by using the U.S. Caucasians, Africans, and African Americans with non-African genotypes removed to determine whether we could distinguish the African population from one another, we first ran FRAP, including all the 94 African individuals. This unsupervised analysis unambiguously separated the San and the Pygmy populations from the West Africans, and to a lesser degree, the 3 West African populations, Yoruba, Mandinka, and Bantu. To be confident in the groupings of the West African population, we performed a series of leave one out FRAP analysis that include 57 individuals from the 3 West African populations. In each FRAP run, we fixed all individuals within their respective populations except for one, whose ancestry was allowed to be admixed and estimated. Results are given in figure S2 in additional file 1. The close genetic relationship of these groups is evidenced by the imperfect ancestry allocation to an individual's own population. However, in every case, FRAP assigns an ancestry to an individual's own population, and in most cases, the large majority the Bantu appear to have closest ancestry to the Yoruba. This is consistent with the Nigerian origins of Yoruba and the presumed origins of the Bantu from the southwestern modern boundary of Nigeria and Cameroon, and the subsequent migration of Bantu east and south. Figure 3 displays the PCA results of the African Americans and the 3 closely related African populations. Several features are worth comment. First, despite their genetic similarity, PCA shows clear separation among the Yoruba, Mandinka, and Bantu populations based on the first 2 PCs. Second, figure 3 reveals that African Americans are placed as a single cluster in the convex whole defined by 3 African groups. So here they're telling you right now that African Americans do not cluster tightly with African groups. That's what a convex whole means. That means they're forming a cloud basically over these groups. And as I read on, that's going to be reinforced very clearly. Figure 4 represents the results of the FRAP analysis of the 128 African Americans in which the 6 HGDP African populations and Caucasians from advance were included in analysis as fixed groups and proportional ancestry estimated for African Americans. Consistent with Figure 1, Figure 4 shows that all African Americans are estimated to have significant ancestry from each of the three West and Central West African groups, with only modest variation among individuals in their ancestral proportions from these groups. As expected, little to no European ancestry is estimated in this FRAP analysis. So this is a graph here, and you can see what it looks like when the European ancestry was included. On the left, that's Figure A, and African Americans are the purple triangles in the middle of the blue European, and on the left is all of the African populations. You can see where it sits before European admixture is removed. Then on the second graph to the right, you can see how African Americans don't cluster tightly with any of these groups, and how they form a cloud basically in between. I've showed the I've showed the example of what a clustered cloud looks like in terms of ancestor to an ancestral population, and maybe I can bring that back up. Well, I'm gonna keep going. But it don't look like that. I'll put it like that. All right, so this figure here, so it says this is Figure A, and then in Figure B, principal components. Okay, so basically, this other figure right here is a zoomed out depiction of what it looks like when they separate the European proportion. And you can see what the convex hole looks like. All right. So it sits closest to Yoruba, but it still doesn't cluster tightly with the Yoruba. Still forms a cloud over it. And you can see how the distance between African Americans and the Mandinka. It's quite a bit of a distance between African Americans and the Bantu. But they're still much closer to. They're close. They're pretty close to Yoruba, pretty close to the Bantu in comparison to the Mandinka and the European admixture. And all of the African groups sit within what they would call the African genome. And I know some of y'all might be like it sits in the African space. In terms of what they determine. And some of y'all might be like, well, James, that's contradictory. They still calling it African. Okay. Let's keep moving, man. Hopefully you guys will be able to decipher, what this paper is pointing out. And like I said, I got a second one to read that's going to basically decipher exactly what my, intuition was when I first came about this study, in which I said it was in the ancestry. The second one is going to reinforce that, but I'm going to keep going with this first one. Table 1 provides the averages and standard deviations of IA derived from the FRAP analysis described earlier for the African components of African ancestry for the 128 African Americans. Overall, we estimate within Africa contributions of 64%, 19%, and 14% from Yoruba, Mandinka, and Bantu respectively. The variances for the various African IA components are much smaller than those for the European IA and are roughly similar across groups, SD ranging from 0.038 to 0.49. These observations are consistent with visual inspection of the bar chart in Figure 4 that African Americans generally derive substantial ancestry from all three West and Central African population groups. We also note from Table 1 that no significant differences exist among African American subgroups defined by U.S. region of birth in terms of IA estimates for any African ancestral component, nor any significant differences in IA found based on gender. Thus, the PC and FRAP analysis of the 128 African Americans based on their African-derived genotype suggests a lack of genetic structure within the African component of their ancestry. To assess this question further, we performed an additional PC analysis on only the African Americans, including only the African-derived genotypes for each individual. So I didn't think they did a real good job in transitioning to that, but that ain't my fault. You know what I'm saying? It ain't my fault. They made it clear in the beginning with the results and the conclusion. And it seemed like, for a second, it seemed like they were saying that, African Americans do cluster. You know what I'm saying? So, but here they're going into saying, thus the PC and FRAP analysis of the 128 African Americans based only on their African-derived genotype suggests a lack of genetic structure within the African component of their ancestry. To assess this question further, we performed an additional PC analysis on only the African Americans, including only the African-derived genotypes for each individual. Figure 5 shows the PCA restricted to African-derived genotypes within the African Americans. In this case, each PC accounts for a very modest amount of variance and no clear pattern is evident. This distribution of the proportion of variance explained by PC revealed a continuous distribution with no outliers. To confirm that this lack of structure was not an artifact of removing genotype data, we performed a similar PC analysis on the original 94 Africans, but randomly deleting genotypes from these subjects at a rate comparable to the genotype. And so what they're doing here, they're trying to figure out, let me finish that sentence first. To confirm that this lack of structure was not an artifact of removing genotype data, we performed a similar PC analysis on the original 94 Africans, but randomly deleting genotypes from these subjects at a rate comparable to the genotype removal rate in African Americans. So what they're clearly saying here is that if this was based on lack of genotypes, because they're trying to think of all possible reasons why this type of anomaly would show itself. So they're thinking maybe African Americans may be missing some genotypes within their African American ancestry components. So what they're doing is they're removing genotypes to see if they see major fluctuations, because if they do, they would have determined that it's because African Americans are lacking something, because they've already determined that their African components are on average about 80%. So they already know that there's an additional 20% that is of a different ancestry, and they're determining it right now to be European. But as I go on, as I segue off of the initial foundation I'm laying here, I'm going to eventually challenge that. I think I found a couple articles that really challenge the accuracy of saying that, African Americans, have on average 20%, because when I'm looking at my own ancestry tree, and like I said, my folks are from Georgia primarily, with a little bit of ancestry coming out of Alabama by way of South Carolina. I know I said this a handful of times, but when I'm looking at all of my ancestry, and all of my ancestry combined is huge. So what I'm saying is historically, because they're making this inference off of historical, activity is a better word for it, but basically, Black American history in terms of how we encountered Europeans, so forth and so on. And so they're making their assumptions to a certain extent based on that. Well, Middle Georgia and West Central Alabama is where, my family's roots are, with nobody left in Alabama, but almost half of one branch is still in Georgia. But they started off in Middle Georgia, just like another branch down there did, on the completely opposite side of the family. And so the significance of me saying this is that for Black American families that are coming out of Middle Georgia, that would be Lower Creek territory. Whether people want to believe that, you know, Black people are indigenous or not, Black people came historically out of indigenous communities. And so one of the other main things that I wanted to mention is that what a lot of people don't know is that Chattel, the British didn't take control of slavery in chattel slavery until 1830, till after the Trail of Tears. The African slavery allegedly, as you know how we feel about it, was predominantly on the coast of the eastern and southeastern borders, or the coastline, I should say. But in terms of inland, in terms of Middle Georgia, the whole of Alabama, because at least Georgia sits somewhat on the coast. You know, when you get to Savannah, they have islands off the coast of Georgia, so forth and so on. It wasn't until the chiefdom and Creek territory and Choctaw Nation was dismantled, and after the Trail of Tears, did the British actually bring so-called African slaves to Middle Georgia and Alabama. And what's even more interesting is that the historical, narrative says that they were African, but what it also says is that they were not African born. When I put it through ChatGPT, through, AI, just asked it a simple question like, were there any documents of these people being born in Africa? And it pretty much said, hell no, because, by that time, these would have been 2 to 3rd generation removed from Africa. But, if you thinking like I'm thinking, and you on the side of the Black indigenous history, that the majority of them were just some straight up Black indigenous captives. You know what I'm saying? But where all narratives will agree is that Middle Georgia, by the time chattel slavery was instituted after 1830, did not have any African-born slaves in that plantation system. You know what I'm saying? So the reason why I'm mentioning that for my own ancestry is if you have family rooted in Georgia or Alabama, you should start seeing Europeans in your family tree from 1830 to 1865, when slaves were emancipated. Because for our roots, that would have been the apex of when that admixture was supposed to take place. So I'm encouraging everybody to go through their ancestry and see that they see that from 1830 to 1865, because I'm up to 1830 in one of my branches. I see no white Europeans in any one of my branches. You know what I'm saying? Now, I haven't taken a consumer DNA test to really compare myself to. My parents have, and of course, some people are gonna like to hear, oh, your parents tested like over like 97%, Nigerian, so a lot of people gonna try to take that and run with that. I've already done an in-depth, dismantling of consumer DNA tests. You know what I'm saying? And the only slavery account that I have in my family is that of a person who has indigenous ancestry as well. At least that's how their children wrote about them. Like I said, that was my great grandfather, who my father said he had his indigenous receipts at one time. And at the time, our folks don't think nothing about proving nothing to y'all. So he like, man, son, I lost that. He was like, so I'm like, pops, we gotta go back and get that. So we'll do that. But I was just giving a little backdrop of how that's supposed to look in our ancestry. If we do have this European admixture, we're supposed to, those who are rooted in Georgia, especially Middle Georgia and the whole of Alabama and anything off the coast, that's when we're supposed to be seeing that. And like I said, as of right now, I don't see none of that. So, anyway, continuing on. I hope I didn't waste too much time talking about that, but I think that was important to say. As can be seen, the two figures appear nearly identical, each demonstrating the structure that exists among these African populations. Thus, the deletion of genotypes did little to diminish the display of population structure, and so the lack of structure that we observe within African Americans is unlikely due to missing genotype data. And see, this is why I had to read this to lay the foundation, because they're already hinting at this, but the narrative says something else. The narrative says, this has to be explained by, diaspora, mixing. They've already made these narratives up before. You know what I mean? So when these geneticists are doing these tests, they have these narratives in mind. And as you can clearly see between this one and the next one I'm going to read, is that these narratives do dictate how they conclude why African Americans look the way that they do. Because they've already said it numerous amounts of times. They said it in the beginning. This is due to diaspora mixing, basically. You know what I mean? Not African ancestry, blah, blah, blah. But how else could it not be African ancestry if the genotypes are not clustering tightly and African Americans lack the architecture? But anyway, let's move on. I don't want to segue too much, man. Another question relates to potential impact of missing genotypes on the FRAP analysis of the African Americans. Individuals with high levels of European ancestry provide less information regarding their African ancestral components, and thus the variance of the African components of IA increases with the amount of European ancestry, but not in the direction away. Discussion. As expected, PCA on our entire sample revealed the greatest genetic differentiation between the U.S. Caucasians and the Africans, with the African Americans intermediate between them, reflecting the recent admixture between ancestors from Europe and Africa. Our estimate of European individual admixture in the African Americans was also roughly consistent with prior studies, with an average of 21.9%. We found considerable variation among individuals in terms of European IA and a number of individuals with particularly high European IA values. And look, I ain't got nothing against, white people, and saying that ain't no white people on my tree. If I find one, it's gonna be what it's gonna be. You know what I'm saying? And I'm gonna be honest about it. But with my parents, excuse me 1 second. I'm gonna flip this. Excuse me, y'all. Got to have my setup perfect. There we go. I ain't got nothing against no races of people. If I find any type of admixture in my family tree, I'm gonna be honest about it and tell y'all. But honestly, right now, I ain't found jack but some black, Negroes, man. That's all I've seen in my family tree. And kind of proud of that shit. But anyway, prior studies focusing on the mtDNA and Y chromosomes have found a greater African and lesser European representation of the mtDNA haplotypes compared with Y chromosome haplotypes in African Americans, suggesting a greater contribution of African maternal descent compared with patrilineal descent. For example, Kaiser and colleagues estimated that 27.5% to 33.6% of Y chromosomes of African Americans are European origin, compared with 9.0 to 15.4% of mtDNA haplotypes. Now, I'm not sure how in depth they're going into these chromosomes. That they're not going into depth every single time. They're just instances going by the haplogroup denotation, in which I said before, a lot of at least a decent amount of African American, so-called African American ancestry is coming from Black Europeans. I've demonstrated that in showing the census records online on Facebook when I've shown considerable amounts of Black Europeans being free during slavery and before slavery in the United States, and they were concentrated more in the South than they were anywhere else, at least in the records that I found. You know what I'm saying? I might just do a whole YouTube session on how to search for that. You know what I'm saying? And I'm gonna just pull out just receipt after receipt after receipt on these on showing these Black Europeans on these census records. But anyway, let me continue. One study at 9 short tandem repeat loci compared the Y chromosomes of African Americans with those of various African populations, including West Africans, West Central Africans, South Africans, Mabutu, Pygmies, Mali, San, and Ethiopians. In multiple dimensional scaling analysis, these authors place the African Americans in the middle of these African groups, suggesting origins from multiple African populations. However, they also found that they could not differentiate the Y chromosome distributions of West African and West Central African groups, presumably a major source of ancestry for African Americans. So basically, they're saying, man, it's what they've been saying. They don't cluster well with these groups. And now they've isolated the Y chromosome. They're like, okay, let's line it up. Y chromosome, and mtDNA. Another study of mtDNA haplotypes in African Americans and different African populations found that more than 50% of the African American mtDNAs exactly match common haplotypes shared among multiple African ethnic groups, whereas 40% match no sequences in the African database they referenced. Fewer than 10% of African American mtDNA haplotypes match exactly to a single African ethnic group. The haplotypes that did match were more often found in ethnic groups of West African or Central African than East or South African origin. Now, some of y'all might take that little small part as a win. That's cool, man. If y'all want to be retarded like that, but go ahead, man. You got to get your win somehow. The most extensive examination of mtDNA haplotypes in Africans and African Americans used mtDNA data from a large number of African ethnic groups spread around the continent. These authors observed large similarities in the mtDNA profiles among ethnic groups from West Central, West, and Southwest Africa, with a continuous geographic gradient. As observed previously, these authors also found that many mtDNA haplotypes were widely distributed across Africa, making it impossible to trace African ancestry to a particular region or group based on mtDNA data alone. So I guess it's not a win for y'all, So, y'all claiming, the ones that's claiming, I'm Nigerian, I'm whatever else you want to claim out of West Africa, is telling you once again that cannot be clearly determined. These authors also estimated the proportionate ancestry within Africa based on African American mtDNA haplotypes at 60% from West Africa, 9% from Central West Africa, and 30% from Southwest Africa, and minimal ancestry from Northeast, Southeast, or South Africa. These studies all suggest close genetic kinship among various West African, Central West African, and Southwest African ethnic groups. A prior analysis of genetic structure among the African populations included in the HGDP based on 377 autosomal STR loci was able to define distinct genetic clusters for the Biaka, Mabutu, and San. However, the study lacked the power to differentiate the Mandinka, Yoruba, and Bantu groups. Similarly, another study examining 2 ethnic groups from Ghana and 2 from Nigeria, based on 372 autosomal microsatellite markers and 493 individuals, did not differentiate these groups by genetic cluster. Analysis have found only modest genetic differences between them. In contrast, Greater resolution of African ethnic groups, particularly for the Mandinka and Yoruba, was possible in our analysis based on more than 450,000 SNPs. We note that in recent study of malaria, PCA distinguished the HAP-MAP YRI individuals, that's Yoruba individuals, from the Mandinka individuals in the Gambian sample on the basis of 100,715 SNPs. However, admixture analysis with few selected markers did not reveal clear clusters that correspond to self-reported ancestry. So here they're telling you within the population, individuals are not clustering to themselves within their own population groups within Africa. It is of interest to compare our African admixture. So to stop right there, right? So if you have the ancestral population not clustering within themselves, of course, it's going to be very difficult for the so-called descendant population to cluster either. Like I said, West Africa is a highly admixed population and historically changed their demographic within very recent times. And here is clearly telling us this. It is of interest to compare our African admixture estimates to descriptions of proportional representation of various African groups to the Middle Passage and slave trade occurring in post-Columbian America. A highly detailed census based on historic records has been documented by several authors. Africans were deported from numerous locations along the broad western coast of Africa, ranging from Senegal in the far west all the way down to Angola in the southwest. In addition, a smaller number of slaves were taken from the southeast of Africa. In terms of the numbers, the largest group, approximately 50 to 60%, derived from central, south, to southern West Africa and the Bight of Biafra, approximately 10% from Western Africa, 25 to 35% from the West Coast, in between, Windward Coast, Gold Coast, and Bight of Benin, and the remaining 5% from the Southeast Africa. These estimates show considerable consistency with our results, which also indicated the largest ancestral components of African Americans to be from Central West Africa, followed by West Africa and Southwest Africa. However, because we did not have groups representative of Southeastern and other parts of Southern Africa, we may have underestimated their ancestral representation among African Americans. It is important to note that considerable migration has occurred among African ethnic groups over the past 3 millennia or more. For example, the 2 Bantu groups included in our analysis originated from a more Central African location, Nigeria, Cameroon, several millennia ago, making precise geographic localization of African ancestry difficult. This difficulty is also reflected in the close genetic relationships among the various West Central, and Southwestern West African groups, who also show considerable overlap in terms of mtDNA haplotypes. Our results are based on examination of the entire autosome genome, a more robust picture of the admixed African ancestry of individual African Americans compared with prior analysis, which focused on only single locus. We found all African Americans in our sample to be admixed with representation from various geographic regions of West Africa. The amount of variation in the African components of ancestry among the African Americans was quite modest, suggesting considerable similarity in African genetic profiles among African Americans. Thus, African ancestry testing based on a single locus, such as the mtDNA or Y chromosome, as in commonly done by ancestry testing companies, provide only a very limited and in many cases misleading picture of an individual's African ancestry. An important limitation in our analysis is the modest number of African subjects and groups represented. However, we were clearly able to exclude certain African ethnic groups as contributing substantially to African Americans, such as the 2 Pygmy and San groups. Furthermore, the close genetic similarity observed among West, Central, West, and Southwest African ethnic groups found by us and others suggests that precise identification of ancestry for African Americans may be difficult, even with the inclusion of additional ethnic groups. I'm going to repeat that again. Where did I start at? Okay, it says pygmy son groups. Okay. Furthermore, the close genetic similarity observed among West Central, West, and Southwest African ethnic groups found by us and others suggests that precise identification of ancestry for African Americans may be difficult, even with the inclusion of additional ethnic groups. All right. So keep going. Very recently, the limited range of African groups included in population genetic studies of Africans was addressed in a landmark study of 113 geographically diverse Africans by Chisholm and co-workers. These authors included 848 microsatellite, 476 indel, and 4 SNP markers to examine genetic structure among these groups, as well as among 98 African Americans from 4 U.S. recruitment sites. In the genetic cluster analysis, they found only modest differentiation amongst West Africans, similar to the findings from other studies of subsets of these groups. Based on the comparable number of markers, they also estimated proportionate African ancestry among their African Americans in the structured analysis, including African ethnic subgroups, allowing the African Americans to be admixed. Comparable to our results within the African Americans, they also found the majority of African ancestry to be West Central, West, and Southwest African, including Bantu and non-Bantu speakers, with somewhat greater representation of the Bantu speakers than the Western non-Bantu speakers. Larger collections of indigenous African populations, such as those described earlier when essayed with dense genotype arrays, as done in this study, will likely add further clarification of the African ancestral origins of African Americans. The results of our analysis also strongly point to random mating amongst African Americans with respect to the African components of their ancestry. This is reflected both by the modest variances we observed in the African IA components and also the lack of structure in the PC analysis of the African Americans with non-African genotypes removed. This conclusion is consistent with the idea that for most African Americans, specific African origins are mixed or unknown or both and do not affect social characteristics that influence choice of mate. It is also consistent with the notion that the African slaves brought to North America were mixed with regard to their geographic and ethnic ancestry and language. By contrast, considerably greater variation in the proportion of European ancestry was found within the African Americans in our study. This high level of variation in European ancestry may reflect recent admixture or non-random mating, or both. These questions require additional study. So there it is. They're concluding that it's based on diaspora mixing at this point. And like I said, in this next one that we're going to get into, they're going to conclude something a little bit different. Conclusions: African Americans typically have African and European genetic ancestry. We sought to characterize the African ancestry of African Americans by using data on more than 450,000 SNPs genotyped to 94 Africans of diverse geographic origins, as well as 136 African Americans and 38 U.S. Caucasians. To focus on African ancestry, we reduced the data to include only those genotypes in each African American that are African in origin. We found that all the African Americans are admixed in the African component of their ancestry, with estimated contributions of 19% West, 63% West Central, and 14% Southwest Central or Eastern, with little variation among individuals. Furthermore, we found little evidence of genetic structure within the African component ancestry in African Americans, but significant structure related to the proportion of a European ancestry. These results are consistent with the mating patterns among African Americans that are unrelated to African ancestral origins. Cast doubt on the general utility of mtDNA or Y chromosome markers alone to delineate the full African ancestry of African Americans and show that the proportion of European ancestry is the leading source of stratification bias in genetic control studies of African Americans. I think that's enough there. We got the gist of that. So that concludes that one. And then I want to get this other one on the screen. Where is it at? Got to put it up there. There it is. It was up there. All right. All right. So, yeah, let's get to it. You can see the title there. Genome-wide scan of 141 African Americans finds no evidence of directional selection since admixture. So this is going to basically, throw a wrench in the diaspora, narrative explanation. Like I've been saying, like I basically predicted before I even saw, this study. You know what I'm saying? And so, there's no study, at least that I've been able to get my hands on, that will clearly say that African Americans are of a different, ancestry. You know what I'm saying? In those particular words. But several studies, when combined, basically do more than hinting at that. You know what I'm saying? And you're gonna see how these, how they word this particular study as we get into it. But you can see the title here: genome-wide scan of 2,941 African Americans finds no evidence of directional selection since admixture. I think it's obvious what they're going to be talking about, but I'm gonna go ahead and get into it. I'm gonna zoom it in, make sure it's good and blown up on the screen. Yeah, I'm gonna blow it up even more than that, man. This gotta make sure this is very much seen for the haters, because they be having a lot to say, man. So we got to make sure they don't talk no more. All right, here's the abstract. The extent of recent selection in admixed populations is currently an unresolved question. We scanned the genomes of 29,141 African Americans and failed to find any genome-wide significant deviations in local ancestry, indicating no evidence of selection influencing ancestry after admixture. All right, so local ancestry obviously means any type of ancestry derived, after transportation from the alleged transatlantic slave trade. All right. And they're saying that they don't see any evidence of that type of ancestry being derived at that point in African American ancestry, or so-called African American ancestry. A recent analysis of data from 1,890 African Americans reported that there was evidence of selection in African Americans after their ancestors left Africa, both before and after admixture. Selection after admixture was reported on the basis of deviations in local ancestry, and selection before admixture was reported on the basis of allele frequency differences between African Americans and African populations. The local ancestry deviations reported by the previous study did not replicate in our very large sample, and we show that such deviations were expected purely by chance, given the number of hypotheses tested. We further show that the previous studies' conclusions of selection in African Americans before admixture is also subject to doubt. So they saying that they don't even believe that pre-admixture is the reason of these deviations or differentiations. This is because the F-stat statistics they use were inflated, and because true signals of unusual allele frequency differences between African Americans and African populations would be best explained by selection that occurred in Africa prior to migration to the Americas. Admixed populations such as African Americans and Latinos are formed by the mixing of generally differentiated ancestral populations. Alleles that are highly differentiated between the ancestral populations and uh, advantageous in the admixed population are expected to rise in frequency after admixture, causing local ancestry to deviate from the genome-wide average. These deviations have been interpreted as a signal of the action of natural selection since admixture. We note that the sampling noise, genetic drift after admixture, and small systematic biases in local ancestry inference will also produce deviations in local ancestry, making it important to account for these factors before concluding that natural selection has occurred. I want to take the time. I think this is something I should point out. Let's see here. Figure 1, ancestry of each location of genome in 141 African Americans. This figure gives the proportion of European ancestry at each of the 118 and 6 SNPs common to all cohorts. The black line indicates genome-wide average proportion of European ancestry. The red and blue lines indicate the threshold for genome-wide significance. In our study, in the Jen et al. Study, respectively, the dashed blue line indicates the significant threshold that was actually used in the Jen et al. Study. The SD was computed empirically over all SNPs. It is clear that no region attained genome-wide significance in our scan for the 6 loci reported under the selection in Jen et al. Dashed vertical lines indicated their location, and the blue points indicated that the deviation is local ancestry. These deviations are reported in relation to the genome-wide average ancestry proportions in our study. None of the 6 reported loci exceeded the threshold for genome-wide significance. So, basically, what I get from that is that they're saying that the European ancestry wasn't a factor. So, anyway, to move on, we're at this inference here, will also produce deviations in local ancestry, making it important to account for these factors before concluding that the natural selection has occurred. To better understand deviations in local ancestry as a signal of selection, we simulated the evolution of local ancestry in the admixed population. The population was created 7 generations ago with ancestral proportions of 80% and 20% from 2 ancestral populations to mimic an idealized demographic history of African Americans. We simulated neutral evolution with a variety of affected population sizes over 7 generations by using a recombination of map built from African American data. For each value of NE, we assess the variance in local ancestry, minimum detectable selection of coefficient, and effective number of statistical tests. Pull this down. Our results suggest that the genetic drift can contribute significantly to the variance in average local ancestry and thus reduce power to detect selection. We note that small systematic biases in local ancestry inference will also contribute to this variance and have a similar effect on power. In light of these simulated results, we sought to investigate possible recent selection in African Americans. We performed an admixture scan for unusual deviations in local ancestry in 29,141 African Americans from 5 cohorts from the African American Lung Cancer Consortium, African American Breast Cancer Consortium, African American Prostate Cancer Consortium, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and Candidate Gene Association resource. Sample sizes and genotyping arrays are listed in table S2. We note that the whatever all that is, cohorts consist of But that's just repeating where they, the consortiums where they got these samples from. But cohorts consist of disease-affected individuals and control subjects, but phenotype information was not available in the current study. The inclusion of affected individuals could produce false positive signals of selection, a result of admixture association. Admixture associations with disease, but is unlikely to produce false negative selection signals, which would only occur if admixture association and selection each caused local ancestry deviations that perfectly negated each other at the same locus. We filtered the data to remove genotyping artifacts related to individuals and individuals with very little European or African ancestry. To estimate local ancestry, we use HapMap3. CEU, which stands for Utah residents with ancestry from Northern and Western Europe, from the Ceph collection, and Yoruba and Abadan, Nigeria haplotypes as ancestral populations in the Hap mix. The average local ancestry at each locus was calculated at an average of the local ancestry estimates across all samples. Because of issues with ancestry inference at the ends of chromosomes, we removed the first and last two MB of each chromosome from analysis. We note that in these regions, 3 loci, which do not overlap any previously published loci, did show significant deviations of local ancestry, but these are very likely to be artifacts. We subsequently focused on the local ancestry estimates for 118,007 SNPs in the intersection of all cohorts. Because of the extent of admixture linkage disequilibrium in African Americans, the number of markers required to tag the entire genome is approximately 2,000 to 3,000, making our use of 118,000 markers sufficient to tag local ancestry genome-wide. The average proportion of European ancestry overall samples in all SNPs was 0.204 with an SD of 0.0036 across SNPs. On the basis of the extent of admixture LD in African Americans, we define the genome-wide significant signal of selection as local ancestry deviation greater than 4.42 SDs, corresponding to 5,000 hypotheses tested. We use the empirical SD because the theoretical SD can be affected by genetic drift after admixture, cryptid and other factors that are difficult to quantify. Figure 1 displays the average local ancestry at each SNP and indicates no genome-wide significant deviation in local ancestry. We note that our simulation suggests that the actual affected number of independent hypotheses might be closer. However, our results remain null even if we correct for only 1,000 hypotheses tested. Additionally, our results remain null in smaller sample of 23,000 individuals with more extensive genomic coverage of 461,000 SNPs. So basically what they're telling you is no matter how they manipulate it, they shrink the sample sizes so they can cover more of the genome. The results remain the same, that this is not in the local ancestry. So I want to point it out. To better understand the implications of these results, we evaluated the range of selection coefficients that we would have high power to detect. Assuming a normal sampling distribution of observed average local ancestry, we can solve for the true average local ancestry that would constitute a genome-wide significant signal of selection. In our case, we had 95% power to detect selection at loci where less than 0.183 or greater than 0.225. Assuming 7 generations since admixture, we performed a grid search of possible values of the selection coefficient for local ancestry to find those that would produce these values of YL and obtain an estimate of 0.019, providing an upper bound on the strength of selection since admixture. Similarly, our simulations with NE equals 50,000, whose variance in average of local ancestry was similar to the variance observed in real data, also indicated a minimum detectable selection coefficient of approximately 0.19. We note that in general, the selection coefficient per local ancestry block will be lower than the selection coefficient per allele, and of 0.019 could correspond to a large value of S representing a strong selection. The conversion between S and S A and C will depend on allele frequencies in European and African poor populations. I know that probably sounds like a whole bunch of jargon, but saying that local selection, in terms of the effect, they're estimating the probability to be below 1%. Our results suggest that the selection stronger than 0.019 since admixture can be ruled out. And they contrast with the report of 6 loci as targets of selection after admixture in a recent study by Jen et al. However, the study considered any deviation greater than 3 SDs times 10 to the third negative third square, well, whatever that is, corresponded to only 20 hypotheses tested to be genome-wide significant. The 6 loci did not replicate nominal significance less than 0.05 in our analysis of many more samples. When we use the threshold of 3 SDs in our data, 6 loci showed significant deviations. None of these overlap those reported by Jen et al., suggesting that the reported signals of selection after admixture are likely to be false positives because of an inefficient correction for multiple tests. For 5 of the 6 loci in Table 1, the deviation that we observe has the same sign as the previously reported deviation. This could be due to statistical chance, genetic drift, admixture, or small systematic biases in local ancestry inference. In any case, our results show that the proportion of African ancestry at the 6 loci was not strongly affected by natural selection since admixture. Allele frequency differentiation can be a powerful test for selection. Indeed, population differentiation between African Americans and the Yoruba was used as the basis of the 14 selection signals recently reported by Jen et al. This was described as a test for selection that occurred after the forced migration of the African ancestors of African Americans. Jen et al. Ultimately concluded that the selection occurred before admixture, given the lack of overlap with signals of selection after the admixture from deviations in local ancestry. Specifically, single SNPs were ranked by an estimate of FStat, and the most highly differentiated SNPs were reported as signals of selection. These single SNP estimates of FStat were produced with the Ware and Cockerham WC FStat estimator. However, a concern with the use of the WC estimator for the application is the estimates can strongly depend on strongly depend on the ratio of sample sizes used. This can potentially result in overestimates of FStat and neutral SNPs, leading to false positive signals of selection. On the other hand, the Hudson estimator, which is a simple average of the population-specific estimators of Ware and Hill, does not have this bias. We assess the magnitude of inflation of WC estimates in the loci reported by Jen et al. So basically, they're saying that this bias is in the algorithmic systems, and so I'll be careful to say that it's attributed to the people performing the test. You know what I'm saying? But it still could be. You know what I mean? But I can't say that for sure just based on the algorithmic testing systems that they're using. Their analysis compared African segments of 1,890 African Americans and 113 YRI at SNPs with minor allele frequency greater than 5% and reported a total of 40 SNPs The 99.9 percentile of 401,559 SNPs tested clustered into 14 loci that had F stats of greater than 0.0452. 10 of these loci were previously unreported targets of natural selection, and 4 were reported as genome-wide significant in the parallel study of Bhatia et al., or nearly genome-wide significant in the case of the HBB, a previously identified target of selection. Of the 10 novel signals, 9 produced lower estimates when we used the Hudson estimator, and 3 fell below the Jen et al. Threshold. We note that the 99.99th percentile of FStat could change as a result of the switch from the WC estimator to the Hudson estimator. However, our analysis indicated that the magnitude of this change will be smaller than the decreases observed at most of the 10 reported novel loci, suggesting that the inflated WC FStat estimates might lead to false positive signals of selection. In addition to having issues of FStat estimation, studies that simply rank the most highly differentiated SNPs between populations are unable to evaluate genome-wide significance of reported signals. On the other hand, model-based approaches can formally assess genome-wide significance. In general, studies that use a model-based approach are well-powered if sample sizes are much larger than 1 divided F-stat, given that both F-stats and sampling noise contribute to the normal variation in allele frequency differences. In genital comparison, the sample size of YRI is 113, is much smaller than the reciprocal F-stat between African Americans and YRI. Let's see. When reevaluated with the model bias approach, none of the reported SNPs achieved genome-wide significance. We know that the model-based approaches do require robust estimates of F-stat, but these are easily available from even small samples of genome-wide data. We re-examined the statistical significance of the 10 novel loci reported by Jen et al. In separate data of the Bhatia et al., which included 6,209 African Americans and 756 Yorubans. But the Bhatia et al. Data include 9 of these 10 loci, and only 4 of the 9 loci were nominally significant without correction for multiple hypothesis testing. Extended analysis to all 29,141 African current study yielded very similar results. Given that the YRI sample size was the limiting, we caution that the 4 nominally significant loci should not be viewed as being independently replicated, because genetic drift is common to both analyses, such that the loci in the tail of one analysis could be expected to lie in the tail of another of the other analysis. The lack of nominal significance at most loci in the non-independent analysis of Bhatia et al. Data suggests that most of the reported novel loci are false positives. We note that the results of the Jen et al. And Bhatia et al. Were both corrected for European admixture either locally or genome-wide. Our analysis agree with the prior results that correction for European admixture is imperative, and found that both corrections perform similarly in terms of power. It is important to recognize that even robust genome-wide significant evidence of unusual population differentiation does not imply selection following the forced migration from Africa. The observed population differences at these loci are best explained by selection within Africa. As an example, we consider the well-studied sickle cell variant RS334 at the HBB locus, where the biological evidence suggests that some selection since the arrival of Africans in the Americas is likely to have occurred. Homozygotes for the recessive allele are afflicted with sickle cell anemia, a debilitating condition that results in very low fertility. However, the minor allele at RS334 is maintained at high frequency in Africa because heterozygotes have increased malaria resistance. The math in the RS 334 in African Americans is 0.050, corresponding to an allele frequency of 0.063 on African segments. Conservatively, assuming the strongest possible negative selection against the minor allele, we calculate the maximum allele frequency difference due to selection post-Africa would be 0.034. However, an allele frequency difference of 0.20 at the HBB locus was reported between Nigerians and Gambians, indicative of a larger allele frequency difference due to selection in Africa. Although these populations have a higher level of differentiation than our comparison of African Americans and Nigerians, we know that the allele frequency differences at HBB are generally related to malaria endemicity and altitude as opposed to F-stat between populations. Thus, we believe that the selection in Africa rather than the post-Africa is the most likely explanation for most of the observed frequency differences between Africans and Yorubans. Overall, we conclude that there is no locus with the genome-wide significant evidence selection influencing ancestry in African Americans after their ancestors left Africa, and that genome-wide significant evidence of population differentiation is likely to be best explained by selection in Africa. In addition, we place an upper bound on the selection that could have occurred after admixture, not to be detected in our data, of greater than 0.019. Although strong selection after admixture can be ruled out by our data, weak selection after admixture occurred, for example, at the HBB locus. Although our results contrast with previous reports of selection post-Africa, this discrepancy can be explained by insufficient correction for multiple tests, usage of the WC F-stat estimator instead of the Hudson estimator, and the action of natural selection in Africa. Several recent studies have investigated unusual deviations of local ancestry and possible signal of natural selection in admixed populations. I guess that would be pronounced Bryce et al. Analyzed 365 African Americans, reported 3 loci with 3 SDs, but correctly noted these differences were not significant after correction from multiple tests. Of hand Sherpa-related populations, thousands of years and focus on genes associated with hemoglobin and levels, they found that the observed deviations at these candidate loci were statistically significant after correction for multiple tests. A recent study used in a new method of local ancestry inference reported 3 loci with very large deviations in local ancestry in 58 Mexican samples, but these very large deviations were not observed in consistent MXL ancestry calls. Let me see here. I think I'm going to start skipping around a little bit because I think the gist of it is gotten. We're almost done with it anyway. Although a number of alternate methods of detecting selection exist, we have focused here on deviations in local ancestry and population differentiation. We conclude with 4 recommendations for future studies utilizing these approaches. First, studies reporting selection since admixture on the basis of deviations in local ancestry in African Americans should employ a genome-wide significance threshold of p less than 10 to the 5th degree. Second, studies reporting selection on the basis of deviations in local ancestry should be cognizant of the possibility that the errors in local ancestry inference can lead to false positive signals, and that reports of the selection might need to be confirmed by multiple methods. Third, studies reporting selection on the basis of population differentiation and involved sample sizes should not use the WC F-stat estimator. Susceptible to bias in the case, and instead should use the Hudson estimator. Fourth, genome-wide significance should not be assessed on the basis of sample ranking, and instead should be assessed via robust model-based approaches. So I think that's enough on that one. I think the point is thoroughly explained. I don't think there's any need for me to read the rest of this. It goes on to, talk in more detail about, different nuances. It's talking about HBB here, so forth and so on. Yeah, that's where I'm gonna stop it at least reading this. Now, so just like I said, they concluded that the differences in these genotypes are in the ancestry portions between African Americans and West Africans. Does it say specifically that African Americans are not West Africans? No, it doesn't. So you're probably thinking once again, or at least the people who, are adversaries to the idea of Black indigeneity in America are probably saying, well, they're still mentioning Africa and things like this. But here's the thing. Here's the thing that you guys cannot get around. And that's the fact that we are supposed to be a descendant population. And what I'm displaying right here is that African American genomes are not cooperating with that narrative very clearly. Do we reside in that genotype space? Yes. But residing in the genotype space does not mean that you are a descendant population of a specific group within that genotype space. And it's pretty much concluded that understanding African American ancestry is extremely difficult for various reasons. This is probably like the fourth article that I've read that says that specific thing. You know what I'm saying? So anyway, I want to matriculate through the rest of what I was supposed to present today. I want to make sure it's on the screen. We approaching 2 hours, so I might have to, maybe make a part 2 and pause it. We'll see how fast I get through these slides. Maybe we can keep it within the hour, or I can keep it within the hour. But I want to get this back on the screen. Man, that share. And I'm going to put this back on the screen, and I want to share what else that I'm going to be talking about. And I think the rest of it should flow a lot faster if I have to, which I probably will, cut it into another part, because I really want to take my time and explain it. And I also don't want to bore people to sleep waiting for this stuff to be explained. And I want to keep up the intensity of, the information as I explain it. So it just might work well for myself and the audience to cut it a little short and, just change, come back and finish it, the following week. But let's see how far I can get with like in the next half hour. Let's see. Anyway. All right. So I read that 2014 study already. Other things I wanted to talk about. Now, this ain't a thing of bashing West African populations or anything like that. You know what I'm saying? This came up as a topic of discussion because, my prior adversary, Sean P., even though this is not, this segment is not directed, solely at Sean P., I'm just reminding the audience of how this, came to be. He made a statement saying that oceanic populations are not similar, to our Negro type, and we're not identical. You know what I'm saying? We're not identical, but he was basically calling them non-Negroes because they integress with Neanderthals and especially Denisovans. So here, I want to demonstrate, and in this case, I'm not going to read the whole study. In this case, I'm going to take you straight to the highlighted material, and get straight to the point. Instead of reading the whole thing, I don't think it's necessary. I'll show you where, the title of the study. It's in the PDF, so I wasn't able to attach it in the description section. Maybe later on I could find the original link to it and put it in there that way later on. But I've had here at the formation of home. Okay, let me read this. Neanderthal and Denisovan variant found in West African population. In one study, geneticists found Neanderthal and Denisovan variants not found in out of Africa populations. But at the formation of Homo sapiens, both Neanderthal and Denisovans had long been removed from Africa. So what I'm saying is that just like, this is basically the reason why, Sean P was outraged when I was, saying this. But as you're going to see, I'm getting this from genetic data. You know what I mean? Because what I've been demonstrating is, all of these ancestral layers that contributed to what we call, West African, ancestry and populations. And so I made a comment suggesting that, not so fast, basically, pump your brakes, because West Africans have somewhat, as minimal as it is, Denisovan and Neanderthal ancestry. You know what I mean? And some people might think that, that's, the so-called white man, putting that on melanated populations or whatever. But I am of the belief that our ancestry is not with West Africans. You know what I mean? So I'm not saying, they ain't us anyway. That's not my deal. You know what I mean? Because I was already trying to relate to the oceanic population, which is definitely admixed with Denisovan, admixture. And, to be honest, this was not direct admixture. This was an ancestral population doing it before, it came to Africa, which is significant. And let me see, this is the next slide. Yeah. So look, which leads me into the obvious question, and basically the same. Not that Sean had a question; he was just outraged by the idea of this, because anybody would be asking, like, how in the hell are you gonna say West Africans have anything to do with Neanderthal or Denisovan, DNA, when historically Neanderthals and Denisovans had left Africa long before, modern Homo sapiens came about. And this is a legitimate question, but it falls right into what I've been saying before, that the population that is, the populations in Africa are heavily, a byproduct of expansion or migration from the east. Now, before, I went over, I had gone over the DE splitting, and now it leads me to the CF splitting. You know what I mean? So this is not necessarily directly from Oceania, but it is of the sister lineage from Oceania, and I will go on to explain here. Revisiting the Tarafolt. Okay, so I put this slide in here to remind myself to explain the Tarafolt. I might be spelling that wrong. I gotta look up the spelling again, but the Tarafolt, mostly Eurasian, and let me see here. I'm gonna pull up the article so at least you guys can see it. So I'm not getting this out of nowhere. Let's see here. I'm just gonna bring it up from my Gmail and put it on here. Let's see here. Scientists outsiders. Blah blah blah. Where is it at? Yeah, here it is. Okay. Okay. So this should be on the screen. I'm gonna double check. Yeah, it is. So I'm not gonna read the whole article. I plan on reading the whole article. Maybe in part two, I will read the whole article. But I just wanted to point out something. I had mentioned the difference between Sub Saharan signals and West African signals and how the two overlap. And people are saying, whatever, man, you just making stuff up, man. You don't know what you're talking about, man. Well, here we're gonna read a part of West African ancestry that wasn't West African, that contributed to West Africans to reincorporate this. It's not even an idea, it's a fact that multiple ancestral layers contributed to what is now West African, especially the Bantu expansion. So the paragraph reads, an international team of researchers have sequenced DNA from individuals from Morocco dating to approximately 15,000 years ago. This is the oldest nuclear DNA from Africa ever successfully analyzed. The study published in Science shows that the individuals dating to the late Stone Age had a genetic heritage that was in part similar to ancient Levantine Natufians and an uncharacterized Sub-Saharan African lineage to which modern West Africans are genetically closest. Okay, so let's read these components one more time, starting at the study. The study published in Science shows that the individuals dating to the late Stone Age had a genetic heritage that was in part similar to ancient Levantine Natufians and an uncharacterized Sub-Saharan African lineage to which modern West Africans are genetically closest. Now, that percentage breakdown of this specimen, was derived from AI, and AI is deriving that from the primary study where it broke it down like that in those percentages. But I didn't want to, inundate the rest of this presentation with that scientific jargon. I just wanted to just give a general understanding of where this information is coming from and where those percentages are coming from. It says that these are Levantine Natufians, so they are Afro-Eurasian in type, but their Afro component is not West African. It says that it is Sub-Saharan African lineage, and it's an uncharacterized Sub-Saharan African lineage to which modern West Africans are genetically the closest. Again, indicating that these genetic relationships are statistical, once again, not identical. All right. I think that's all I really wanted to read from that. Just wanted to, just implicate the age there and genetically what this specimen was made up of. Within that Eurasian component as well, is and was, some Neanderthal and some Denisovan, signals as well within this specimen. You know what I'm saying? But as I'm going to go on to talk about later on, I might be in my notes to talk about it right after this, is that there was another Levantine component. So let me check my PowerPoint, see what my cues are to see what I'm supposed to be pulling up. See what this next slide says. Other Levantine contributors. The Neanderthal variant can be explained by the Levant. So what I'm saying here, the Neanderthal variant can be explained by Levantine ancestry alone. But what I'm gonna go on to say in this next slide is that the Denisovan variant cannot. So obviously, where did it come from? All right. Answer is AI analyzes that the signal came by way of the Y-DNA F haplogroup. And this is how I'm tying this into oceanic populations, how all of this stuff is how all of these ancestries are intertwined together. Later on in this presentation, I'm gonna relate it to ancient population groups and how that's intertwined, how Albert Perry fits in and his Y-DNA fits in and everything like that. AI analyzes that the signal came by way of the Y-DNA F haplogroup. I got here in the notes, read the excerpt from the study. Excerpt from the study. Can't remember exactly what that excerpt was, but I believe it would have to be this right here. Not this one, but this one. And let me make sure that's on the screen. All right, so let me stop sharing and make sure it's on the screen. Oh yeah, we getting to the bulk of it, man. About to put all this to sleep, man. Why y'all do this? Why y'all make me do it to you? All right, so this whole paragraph starting right here. Let me make sure it's on the screen. Yeah, perfect. I'm gonna zoom it in some more. Let me see how that look on the screen. Uh-huh. Yeah, I think that's pretty good. I think y'all should be able to see that pretty nicely. So let me go back up to the study, the title of it, so you guys can see it. I had to zoom that back out a little bit so everybody can see it. Okay. So this is titled The Deep Population History in Africa. All right. And this is the PDF version. And down here on page 3 of 9, I'm going to start at the introgression from extinct lineages. And I'm going to miss as much as possible. And I'm going to check, make sure one more time it's on the screen. Good. Very good. Introgression from extinct lineages. There has been a resurging interest in the question of archaic admixture in Africa, with the recovery of the first genome-wide data from Neanderthals and Denisovans. Admixture from these archaic groups has become evident in non-Africans. With new methods that do not necessarily require a reference genome from the introgression lineage and better genome data, it is now possible to investigate the question of introgression from extinct lineages in Africa. Given the rich human and hominid history in Africa, the lineage leading to modern day humans has the potential to interact and also mix with hominid groups that separated from our lineage far back in time, perhaps on par with the divergence of Neanderthals and Denisovans some 600,000 years ago. Now, right here, it is talking about a ghost population. But that I'm gonna highlight that later on in the discussion. But this whole genetic study, constantly reincorporates this ghost lineage that's been detected in West Africa, especially Rubens. Now mind you, so-called African Americans, cluster the closest, even though it's not a clean cluster. It's a convex whole, like the study says, but that is the population that African Americans show the most similarity to. This one happens, I believe, to have the most ghost DNA integration. And right here, we can see that it's not talking about Neanderthals and Denisovans because it says it was on par with these groups. But later on, it's going to say specifically that they're talking about a ghost lineage. It is also likely that distinct modern human groups existed, possibly divergent a few 100,000 years ago or more recently, that later disappeared from some reason. For some reason, such populations could have mixed with human groups that did contribute substantially to today's people in Africa. We can refer to this latter phenomena as integration from ghost populations, and the former case is archaic integration. So they separate it right there. They're saying specifically we can refer to this latter phenomena as integration from ghost populations, and the former case is archaic integration. So for anybody that thinks what I posted on Facebook, for those who might be watching, that I'm just making this up, to make, African Americans look like some type of fantastical, population group, this, that, and the other. Well, it ain't my fault. You know what I'm saying? It ain't my fault. Now, this ghost lineage is not captured in out of Africa populations. I don't think it's even, well, I saw one article indicating that it is in oceanic populations, but it's not in, European populations, and it's not in, East Asian populations and so forth and so on. Obviously, if it's, closer to the root, it probably just spells out dilution. You know what I mean? And it had a heavy hand in shaping, groups early on in the, Homo sapien line, so to speak, ancestral line. But moving on, one way to separate these two integration processes is to define archaic integration as involving a hominin group separated from the human lineage before the deepest divergence among modern humans some 300,000 years ago, and ghost integration involving extinct anatomically groups that separated around 300,000 years ago or more recently. Since the publication of the Neanderthal genome, the Neanderthal admixture to human populations is continuously being unraveled, which also has bearing on the understanding of the demographic history of African populations. The West African Yoruba have often been used as an unadmixed reference population to estimate global Neanderthal admixture proportions, although they have been shown to carry small levels of Neanderthal ancestry. A new method that eliminates the need for an unadmixed modern source showed that the Neanderthal ancestry proportion in Africans was larger than previously thought. Chen et al. Found, on average, 17 MBs. I forgot what that unit, stands for. I think it's a measurement of haplotype block segment length. I'm pretty sure that's what that is, of Neanderthal sequence per individual, of which 94% is shared with non-Africans. So they're saying that there is, well, I'm gonna go ahead and read. I ain't gonna stop. I'm gonna keep reading. It'll make sense as I read it. Of which 94% is shared with non-Africans. Bickerstrom et al. Also find archaic variants from Neanderthal and Denisovans in West Africa that are absent in non-Africans, reflecting the larger genetic variation. Ancestry in modern Africans can be explained by European-like source in Africa, supported by other studies that found Neanderthal ancestry to correlate with Eurasian proportions. I just want to make sure it's known, man, that everything I'm saying, it's not coming out of thin air. I'm not making this up. The haters want to say wobble this and wobble that, but I'm coming with nothing but the receipts, and I'm letting it be known. You know what I'm saying? And so I'm gonna continue on with my PowerPoint prompts. So I can make sure, and I'm gonna end this and put my PowerPoint prompts back up so everybody can see it. Make sure it's on there. So I read that part. Back to the PowerPoint. Let's see what's next up. Why DNA-F diverged from the superclade CF 70 to 75,000 years ago in Southeast Asia. So what I'm demonstrating right here again is the east to west migrational pattern. And we know that this has to be the pattern because, at that time, Denisovans were only in Southeast Asia and Oceania. So I'm just showing how this wraps all the way back around for people who, like Sean P, who wants to say, we ain't got nothing to do with that ancestry. We over here in Africa, that's not affecting us because, we only Black African over here. We Sub Saharan, we West Sub Saharan, we this, we that, and that's all we are. No, we're not. Or I shouldn't say we, because like I said, I believe, Black Americans are indigenous to America. But no, that's not what it is in Africa. And I've showed you data now, specifically from a report that says, in other reports, that other reports are reporting the same thing. So everything is converging at the same point in terms of genetic data. These are several sources saying the same thing according to this one report. All right, so likely encountered Denisovans in Southeast Asia. I should have put more than likely because that's the only place they're gonna get it from, especially coming from the CF super clade. Produces the primary haplogroups that will provide much of the genetic structure from the Levant and Europe, which will be haplogroups Fi, J, and R1 through R to R1b. Now I've talked about this before in the Malta population, where I pointed out that the Malta population contributed. That's the population where the R1 is found at the oldest. And it seems like the distribution of R1 was from that population. This population, again, is in the east, inside ancient Siberia. And I explained during that presentation how the R1 would migrate to the Levant and differentiate into R1b, and that R1b would distribute itself into Africa and differentiate into V88. There would be more differentials, in Europe and throughout the Levant. And so as we go on, and hopefully I hammer this home, we're going to see that pretty much the entire Levant, for the most part at least, was shaped by Eastern migrational gene flow. So here, and I'm going to continue to read so I can line this up, and you're going to, hopefully you guys will see what I'm saying. We know this non-subjectively because notably the Mesolithic population associated with Cheddar Man in Europe was haplogroup I. At least Cheddar Man himself was haplogroup I. I can't say that this whole group was haplogroup I, but more than likely, at least the majority of his group was haplogroup I, which is derived from haplogroup F. And the Malta population were non-subjectively R1, just as I mentioned, which diversified into R1b in the Levant. These F haplogroup carriers, along with the Natufian population groups, would lay the structure for Afro-Levantine population groups before the Levant received later European admixture from population turnover. Now, that population turnover came from Anatolian-related groups that actually the Malta population contributed to, because the Malta population, just as I just read, is they're responsible for the contribution to early Europe as well, especially the group that that replaced the Mesolithic population that Cheddar Man was a part of. That heavily came from the Malta population. If you're tracking, man, if you're tracking everything that I put together, and this stuff is based off of scientific data, if you're tracking, then you know that the Malta population contributed to Europeans, and in the early formation of what you would call the Northern European look. You know what I'm saying? And this is reincorporated by by another study in 2025 that was basically saying that depigmentation alleles didn't become prominent in Europe until about 3,000 years ago. Anybody that knows me knows that I've been putting that up, to show people what Europe looked like up until very recent, and that is just the depigmentation alleles being present in the genome. That doesn't guarantee that they were being physically expressed. As a matter of fact, based on how these depigmentation alleles had to basically stabilize themselves, the people carrying these depigmentation alleles who were expressing them, according to genetic data, had to remain isolated until they became stabilized. And maybe I can get into that a little bit deeper and pull some genetic studies to, further reincorporate that and demonstrate that from some primary genetic sources. But yeah, stabilization had to occur once it expressed itself, which delayed the appearance of those who carried these Northern European phenotypes. That is absolutely facts. But anyway, this is demonstrated by the Tarafolt specimen found recently in Morocco, dating back to 15,000 years. I've already went over that. I don't think it's necessary for me to go back over that again. All right. Tarafolt and Levantine gene flow to the west to West Africa. It is determined that a wave of Eurasian gene flow entered Africa in two waves. The first being 20,000 years ago. That would have been primarily with the Tarafolt. And then the second being 5,000 years ago in West Africa for North Africa and directly from the Levant. This timing is either simultaneous with Bantu expansion or predates it, and is the Eurasian expansion mainly responsible for the Denisovan variants found in West African populations. So let me again, reconnect these and put it together. I demonstrated where the gene flow was coming from. It came from the F haplogroup, which split from the CF. The C is a part of the oceanic. The C haplogroup is responsible for the Melanesian, Austronesian, oceanic groups. The F is primarily responsible for the Levantine gene flow. And that's where it came from. All right, so residual effects. It is important to note that West Africans on average only carry roughly about 0.03% of either Neanderthal and or Denisovan DNA. But it is as equally important to note that the migrational gene flow pattern that is responsible for Denisovan gene, but it is as equally important to note that the migrational gene flow pattern that is responsible for the Denisovan gene variant that some modern West African populations, like the Yorubian population, demonstrates. Because again, they carry a rare variant that no non-African populations carry, which is very interesting. I don't think that, out of African fans were aware of that. It might change how you feel a little bit now, maybe. Maybe you might be a little bit prejudiced now that you know how Africa was really shaped now. You know what I'm saying? Y'all gonna stay on that bandwagon now? Nah, for real. Like I said, this ain't no celebration about that. You know what I'm saying? It's just telling it like it is. and how West Africa was shaped. You know what I mean? It's actually pretty interesting. It's interesting whether or not African Americans come from West Africans or not, which in my opinion, I don't believe that they do. You know what I'm saying? But even if they did, this is still very interesting how West Africa was shaped. But anyway, this points again to modern African populations being established by gene flow from the East. All right. We got the portion when I'm going to incorporate Albert Perry's DNA. Albert Perry's DNA reveals ancient population structure. I would go to the extent of saying that, okay, so I'm going to read this whole title. Albert Perry's DNA reveals ancient population structure, possibility of non-African ghost integration, and signs of ancient population structure in America hundreds of thousands of years prior to Siberian migration. If it wasn't for Albert Perry's Y-DNA being discovered and really the entire AOO discovery, the whole, population structure being 300,000 years or more would have never been discovered. It might have been discovered later through, another channel. But the discovery in Albert Perry made it even more easier to understand that the population structure in human beings was highly structured before out of Africa. You know what I'm saying? And it was comprised of mainly populations that don't exist today. You know what I mean? So I'm pointing this out because within this indigenous community, we constantly said this. People say we're crazy. We're just a wild boast for saying it. We don't have any scientific evidence, blah, blah, blah. You know what I'm saying? Any excuse not to accept that type of theory. You know what I mean? Because like I said, a lot of people are heavily indoctrinated. And they're just not ready, man. But, ready or not, here I come, man. I'm going to give you these receipts like I said I was going to give it to you. And this is going to come from that same article. That article was a huge find. You know what I mean? Because it contains a lot of, genetic information that a lot of people within this community are hitting at. It's a solid one. But anyway, what Perry's DNA revealed: deep Homo sapien structure dating back to over 300,000 years. The previous estimate, I guess you could say, it was anywhere between 150 to 250,000 years ago. All right, 250 on the high end, I think it was. Let me see what this next one says. What's often misunderstood: AOO is a direct ancestor of modern Homo sapiens. It is not. Perry's A00, I should say, not, I'm gonna say L, forget all that. It rolls off the tongue better. Perry's AOO is the same as the AOO found within populations in West Africa. It is not. They both represent two separate branches that split from a more basal AOO anywhere from 3,000 to 73,000 years ago. Perry's branch was found in Africa. It was not. All right. And I'm going to show you. Read the genetic study. For time wise, I ain't going to read the whole genetic study. It won't be necessary. I'm just going to go to this illustration. Hopefully I can find it real quick. If not, I can always bring it back up. No problem. I just passed it. Here it is. Okay. So I'm going to stop sharing this. And I'm going to go back. And I'm going to bring it up on the screen. I'm preparing. All right, we'll go back, make sure it's on the screen. Yep. I'm even try to zoom that thing in, man. Make sure this is seen. This illustration is all you really need, man. Maybe in the part 2, I'll read it more thoroughly. I'll think about it. But I'm going to scroll up, let you see the whole dynamic. All right. So, obviously, as you can see, it's saying that modern humans, due to the discovery of the AOO, is now estimated to have split roughly around 338 years ago, with the high estimate of 481 years ago. Wow. And a low estimate of 237. Now, if you follow the branch down from here to here, you can see that it splits. And you can see that the AOO line is over here, and that splits into the African American Albert Perry line, and then it splits over here to the MBO. So all of y'all were saying, AOO was found in West Central Africa, so Albert Perry's isn't significant. It was significant enough. His subclades were significant enough to demand another branch. Just know that. And just know that his particular branch is not found in Africa. All right. All right. This is an African American lineage based on who's carrying it, which is only the, as far as what's been found, at least what I know is only, Albert Perry. But anyway, and then if you go to the other side of the splitting at 338 years ago, you see here that splits into AO. Now, what's significant, remember I said that, people think that the whole Homo sapien lineage is a direct, descendants of the AOO. And you can see here clearly that it is not. That doesn't mean that autosomally that they didn't contribute to, humanity in terms of, gene flow or gene input into, Homo sapiens that came under or descended from AO. But they are not direct ancestors, as you can see. I felt like that was pretty interesting, and I think that needs to be understood, because the reason why I'm pointing that out is because we're seeing evidence of extinct populations that were, potentially heavy contributors to a much older layer. Again, the coalescent times, the range is from 237 to 581 now, with the finding of this AOO Y haplogroup. So, you know what I mean? This ain't no wobble science. This is real science. And now I'm gonna get back to that same article that I was reading earlier, and it's gonna reincorporate all of this ghost lineage, all of these different different possibilities, what human structure looked like. And when I'm done reading this, I think I'm gonna cut it, and then next week I'm gonna bring the supporting articles of population structure, early population structure outside of Africa that basically disrupts this whole out of Africa timeline. So I'm gonna bring that next week, because I'm gonna take my time, and I'm gonna read this stuff that's in this article to make sure it's clearly understood and hammer this point home. So the haters won't have no room to wiggle. Can't let y'all wiggle. So let me get this back on the screen. It's fun beating y'all up, man. Y'all just don't know no better, man. Because when it's all said and done, it ain't gonna be no more you just making this up. It's just gonna be y'all not accepting the truth. That's what it's gonna boil down to. So let it be known. That's all it's gonna be. because I'm going to talk my talk, and then I'm going to come right back and I'm going to back it up. Matter of fact, before I even get to this, I think it's some highlighted stuff above this that I wanted to read, just some brief stuff. Okay, here it says, the any starts to differ between Khoisan and all other groups some 300,000 to 200,000 years ago, demonstrating that there was population structure at that time, followed by population decline that affected populations differently. Make sure that's on the screen. Yeah, that's on the screen. I'm gonna zoom that a little bit. Now I'm gonna go down here and I'm gonna pick, start, talking about ghost integration, its possibilities, so forth and so on. And I'm gonna make sure that I'm on point with this PowerPoint and make sure I'm covering all my points real quick. So I'm gonna stop sharing that and I'm gonna bring my PowerPoint back up just to make sure I'm on point with that. Make sure I stay on track. Okay, so I read that genetic study. Ancient population structure, that's where I'm at now. Yep, covered that. Yep. Okay, so I kind of just read that a little bit, and I'm going to point this slide out in particular because this is important. Now, I know people are going to try to say I'm making this up, but if you understand the general principles about Africa, geneticists state that they are able to infer a significant population loss right at the point of out of Africa. You know what I'm saying? So let me read this. Due to coalescent timing with parameters set from AOO and out of Africa timing, which took place through the CT superclade roughly 70,000 years ago, geneticists are now able to determine that out of Africa was not the beginning of humanity's expansion, but a bottleneck or significant population decline. Studies now show evidence of non-singular expansion of human population, which is now that ain't one word right. Anyway. Okay, what I was getting at is that it now implicates basically an autochronous, movement of origin in the group or multiple population groups simultaneously. This idea was once considered fringe, but is now slowly being supported by archaeological evidence. So in this community, we constantly said that. People keep telling us that we just making it up. It's not supported by science. It's just some fantastical stuff that we made up. But I'm going to read it from this study. And then we're going to wrap this part one of African Americans Ain't African part two. Matter of fact, I'm gonna have to call this second part just something totally different because this ain't gonna concern African Americans directly in a way it kind of does with the indigenous, things that we believe in, and that'll make sense later on. But I want to answer the question of how do we know that there was a bottleneck? Because the AOO showed population structure dating back beyond 300,000 years ago. Out of Africa expansion only happens through one lineage, CT. In function, this by definition would be a bottleneck because the ancient population structure only survives as a remnant through CT. CT is responsible for all out of African populations and some in African populations like the E haplogroups, according to the out of Africa model. Okay. So basically what I'm saying is the way that you can infer that this was a bottleneck is because we know that there were other population groups not directly captured in the lineage that out of Africa came from. It did not come from the haplogroup AOO. but AOO existed over 300,000 years ago. So if AOO is not included in that lineage, then we know a considerable amount of populations are no longer here with us. You know what I'm saying? Because there was a more basal AOO before Albert Perry's Y-DNA and before the West Central African branch of AOO. You know what I'm saying? And this study is just going to go on to reincorporate and reinforce the idea of, and really it's not an idea, they're saying that they know now of this significant population structure. And so they know that this population structure didn't make it into the CT's expansion out of Africa. And that, and not even going to say that they weren't out of Africa at this time, but there was a major population decline before CT's expansion, put it like that. And that's how we know. Plus, on top of that, there is only one lineage that is responsible for the expansion of where, today's modern population comes from. It was only through one lineage, and that was CT. So if you have a huge population structure or a significant population structure, and then it only makes it out through one lineage, by definition, that's a bottleneck. Y'all can argue with yourselves all you want. Let's go look it up and understand the principles of what a bottleneck is, and you're going to understand that that is the definition of a bottleneck. All right, so let's see here. All right, so I'm just going to go back to the article and minimize that. And I'm going to bring that same article back up. And I'm going to get into this ghost and aggression part, which is very interesting. It says here on this left column, I'm going to make sure it's on the screen. Yeah, that's pretty good. I'm going to zoom in even more, though. Make sure y'all see that. Yeah, I'm going to crack it down tonight, man. It has been hypothesized that interbreeding with archaic populations happen frequently, but at low levels, especially West Africans have often been identified to harbor archaic ancestry. This signal has been shown to come from one or more populations that split from the ancestors of modern humans approximately at the same time or slightly earlier than the Neanderthal split. Another signal or alternative explanation to the archaic integration has been proposed for West Africans with integration from a ghost population which split around 300,000 years ago. The admixture signal from archaic or ghost population in West Africa is consistent with the non-symmetrical relationship of the Kozan populations to West and East African populations. Furthermore, the differences in archaic ancestry proportions across Africa indicate that population structure can already have been established at the time of integration, or alternatively, this observation can be a consequence of gene flow from non-Africans. Didn't I tell y'all they said that this was a possibility? I told you I ain't just making this up. Some studies have also suggested that the integration sequences come from a population with a large NE, which hints at it being a structured population itself. Yeah. Everything I said is being said here. Another possibility is that the large NE is shaped by multiple integration events from divergent lineages, which are hard to distinguish without archaic reference sequences. Unfortunately, many studies of archaic or ghost integration in Africa focus on a few populations and/or use only one method for inference, so that the effect of the identified archaic or ghost integration is not yet comparable across all major branches of modern humans in a systematic way. Interestingly, many studies identified a fairly recent time for the integration from extinct lineages in Africa, with integration events even after the split from non-African populations, hinting at survival of archaic populations until relatively recent in time. This contrasts with observations from the fossil record, where most of the morphological diversity disappeared before 100,000 years ago. says of these include, well, I'm going to go down here. The diverse morphology from fossil finds, material culture, and genetics are hinting against a purely single origin of modern Homo sapiens in Africa, but possibly for emergence from a scattered, diverse population with sporadic gene flow. And I tell y'all, man. And I tell y'all it won the game, man, and that's where I'm gonna stop it at. I'm gonna let that marinate on y'all, man. Yeah, we putting this out of Africa thing to rest. You know what I'm saying? So-called African Americans are not cooperating with being descendants from West Africans. You know what I mean? We putting that to rest. That's I'm gonna have to get a tombstone for both of those ideas now. You see why? I've clearly demonstrated that West African populations were put together by multiple gene flows. Let me show this illustration too of what they got in here. Let's zoom this out a little bit. So you see all of these different branches. Some branches are bigger than others, but none of them are directly related. You guys hollering about, what y'all hollering about? You know, it's like, man, Bluetooth and all this. You know what I'm saying? Showed me some Shamalaka, something from Shamalaka. You know what I mean? Where it clearly shows you that this is a different lineage, and none of them are directly related to itself. You know what I mean? And that's because they are remnants of ancient populations. Period, point blank. So this whole idea of connecting so-called African Americans to any individual group has been shown to be, like I've read in several other articles, very difficult and cannot be determined by this Y DNA or this mtDNA for all of the DNA groupies, man. You see it here. What more do I need to say? You know what I mean? But like I said, in the next part, I'm gonna go into more detail. I'm gonna pull, several more articles, and since I'm ending it here, that'll give me a reason to pull those articles up and read them in totality. You know what I'm saying? At least close to it to demonstrate, ancient, population structure outside of Africa. Signs of that. You know what I mean? So I'm gonna put that all together next week. I think this is a perfect place to stop it here. I think I've shown everything I need to show to, lay the foundation for next week. And yeah, y'all eat it up, man. I think this has been pretty thorough. I know it started off slow because I had to read those articles, you know what I mean? But it had to be done so I can lay the foundation down so, the haters can't say that, it wasn't read in totality, like I was withholding information or something like that, man. That's all going to be over with, man. That's all going to be over with. So peace out to whoever's watching, you know what I'm saying? And I got much more to come, man. It's really just getting started. And mind you, I haven't even come with the indigenous receipts yet, man. I'm laying the foundation, man, because after this portion is done, the portion that I'm going to start with the indigenous receipts are also related to genetic studies, of which I'm going to start with genetic diversity, and I'm going to tie that in. It's going to make sense later, man. I don't want to give it all away, but I'm going to tie that diversity in with morphology, and I'm going to pull the morphology, genetic reports and everything like that. And then I'm going to start getting into the history. You know what I mean? I was talking about a little bit of it with, my roots, being in middle Georgia and Alabama and so forth and so on, and how a lot of people think that, chattel slavery happened in those regions just off the bat. No, it didn't. So that lets you know slavery, just like I read that article, was incorporated with indigenous populations as slave captives up until roundabout Trail of Tears. And then after that, chieftain was dismantled, and the British brought the chattel slavery to middle Georgia and Alabama, these inward regions off the coast. And that only lasted remarkably for only roughly about 35 years or less. I know that sounds strange to most y'all because y'all think, chattel slavery was going on off the rip in in the southeast, with Africans. Nah, no, it didn't. You guys can go check the archives in Georgia. You guys can go check the archives in Alabama. No, it didn't. It only lasted from 1830 to 1865. And there were no African-born slaves during that time period. They assumed that they were second and third generation Africans. But what they know is that they were not born in that. They were not African born. Eat that up, man. The game is just about over, man. I'm just getting started, man. So peace out, peace and blessings. We ended this right before 10 o'clock. I think this was pretty good timing. And like I said, man, next week is on and popping even more, man. I got more receipts, man. I ain't even got time for them all, man. 3 hours. And I'm just a little bit halfway done with what I was supposed to present, man. But I ain't going no further, man. I'm gonna go get some sleep, relax, enjoy the rest of the evening, man. And I'm gonna let y'all enjoy y'all rest of y'all evening, man. Peace out.